Hey Noah, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing pretty good, Raphael. Thanks.
Yeah, I was when you reached out to me, I was actually really happy that you reached out again because on our first episode, I felt like I left a lot on the table. And to be super honest with you, like it took me a while. It was like there was like a 20-second lag between what you were saying and how I was understanding it. And obviously that's just because of my lack of knowledge with everything that you've covered. So if I and again, I'm just gonna sort of give a really brief intro. Um, right now, you're sort of battling the patents office because you have a new system, a new, I guess, economic system. Please correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, but it's a new economic system that you're trying to basically change the capital markets and the way that it functions in a way that's more efficient, in a way that's better for the both for the purchaser and for the consumer and from the provider of the products and services. Right. So correct me if any of that is wrong.
Uh, there's a few technical curly cues, but yeah, that's basically correct.
Okay, so Noah, for people that haven't seen the first episode, give us, if you don't mind, give us sort of the story of how it is that you get here. And I'm really super interested in how you discovered this problem that you're trying to solve currently, and then maybe we can kind of work our way up to now, sort of all of the headaches you're getting with the patents office.
Absolutely. So, in brief, I'm very interested in computational mathematics and computer operation. And I was looking at news. This was over a decade ago at
Mhm.
this point. I was looking at news and upcoming things, seeing things like Internet of Things, having lots more sensors plugged into the internet, um, rapidly expanding social media. The AI was starting to come out into burgeoning. NLP, natural language processing, looked like it was starting to happen. And uh, I had already worked at a number of companies that had been overwhelmed simply by their own computer systems.
Mhm.
Just your computer, you may or may not know this, logs lots of stuff that it's doing all the time, and those logs can be very comprehensive. And if you're in a company, particularly a web-based company, your web server basically knows everything there is to know about your customers, and you know, well, usually nothing about them. So you've got people making decisions when the information that could guide those decisions is locked up in just enormous piles of fluff that nobody could possibly work their way through. So I was thinking about that problem. How do you extract useful information from a very large, noisy network? And I found an approach uh, using game theory, basically creating a system that allows you to create incentives for the network to communicate clearly to you. And as what was at the time a personal challenge, I decided to figure out how to turn this thing into a marketplace. Because if you think about markets from an information and communication point of view, what the marketplace is doing is selling price information to some participants and buying price information from other participants and negotiating that transaction between those two groups. Um, and then that price information is utilized by people that are buying and selling their products and services at the prices that they get. So it's sort of a triune rather than a bilateral system. And once I had actually worked out the structure of such a system and coded one up to sort of check out its behavioral characteristics, I discovered that its behavioral characteristics were significantly better than the characteristics of the systems that we actually have. Just because by designing it in this fashion, it radically cuts down on the amount of noise or waste signals or fraud that would be put into the marketplace.
Okay. Um, so for somebody that may be watching this and may not be super familiarized, myself included, with game theory, could you mind breaking down what game theory is and then how you use that concept into this new model?
Absolutely. So game theory has its roots in the early 20th century. It is the mathematics of strategy, and it
Mhm.
looks at outcomes when there are multiple decision capable actors, and each of those actors has its own agenda. So, in a scenario where everybody wants the same thing, the game theory is very boring. Everybody does the
Mhm.
thing that everybody wants, and everybody gets that thing, and it's all good. But if there's any kinds of conflicts, whether those are competitive or cooperative, then the interactions of different choices start start becoming critical and important. And so game theory, it turned out, once people started examining some of these things, became a very general model for describing things like ecosystems and evolution, things like markets, things like political campaigns, things like conflict. Probably the most famous use of game theory was the formulation of America's Cold War nuclear strategy, and the development of mutual assured destruction as the plan, um, uh, quite rightly known as MAD.
Okay, my introduction, when this is way back to game theories, was something that was called the prisoner's dilemma, where you have basically two people in separate rooms,
Right.
and then they have to, without knowing, right, or being able to talk to each other, it's basically tries to find what would be the best outcome for both, right?
Absolutely.
Considering that there's not enough evidence to convict both of them, and obviously that those sort of that mathematical collaboration, I guess.
Right. Well, that gets into one of the more interesting ways that this was developed. So, game theory at heart is expressed in these numerical terms, but the game theorists found that those systems were very abstract and hard to, get your intuition around, and
Mm-hmm.
also they get very, very big, very, very quickly. The number of possible games, it grows faster than exponentially or geometrically. People can be used to those terms. Um, it, so what they did was these little stories were generated for simple strategic situations, because it turns out that many practical strategic situations can be seen as sort of combinations of these fundamental pieces of strategy. And so the prisoner's dilemma is a what's known as a psychotic game. It is one where following the incentives intrinsic to the game harms you. So in the prisoner's
Mm-hmm.
dilemma, the two prisoners who are each being sweated, as you laid out, each prisoner gains by betraying their partner. But if they both betray each other, they get that sort of worst case outcome where now they're both in prison for something they didn't either of them have to be in prison for, because their confessions are the evidence. Um, and and as you mentioned, cooperation. One of the interesting things about Prisoner's Dilemma is that while as a one-off game, it certainly makes sense to betray your partner, in a sequential game, we're going to play it over and over and over again. You never know if this is your last shot. Not betraying your partner starts making more sense, because if you betray them today, they might get to betray you back again tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And the immediate gains from backstabbing them now will be outweighed by the many, many backstabs that are coming your way in the future. And so we have this situation where the stable nature of a game actually flips on its head once you're going to play it more than once. And that's another thing that shows up over and over again in game theory, where uh, we see this in nature, where some animals that we have classified as parasites, we are now classifying uh, as having a good relationship, because it turns out that there's sort of second order effects that they're causing that are actually helpful, and we have other cases where we're downgrading animals to be parasites because we've again taken a look at second order effects. So an example of this would be the oxpecker. There's a bird in Africa that flies around and eats parasites off of large animals. And when it was first observed and categorized by like British nationalists, or naturalists, they said, "Oh, this is a eugenic, thing. It's helping out. It's eating the parasites." Closer examination has discovered that it will actually continue to peck and open and keep open the wounds on those creatures and drink their blood. And so if their parasite load is low enough, the birds will become the parasite, and we're
Interesting.
reclassifying. So um, we get these bizarre situations where uh, deep consideration can be different and even reverse shallow consideration. And game theory gives us this forum where all of this just falls out of the mathematics.
Correct me if I'm wrong. When I first heard about this, I kind of started thinking about the concept of karma, right? And so I was like, okay, if you follow this model, it probably makes more sense to never play the game of life in a way that is always seeking your own benefit, but rather helping and giving more and taking the benefit of others into consideration. And I sort of, experience this is maybe just anecdotal experience, but the moments where I was, let's say, only looking out for myself, maybe treating people with disdain or disrespectfully, some way, somehow, life had a really interesting way of bringing that back to me in a different manifestation of the problem. Right? It didn't always have to be direct, but if I sat long enough and thought about it, I could see that it was always connected to something else that I had done in the past. Usually, again, for my own self interest, and not in the best spirit of collaboration with other human beings. Is that, you think, a good way to experience sort of the effects of game theory in your everyday life? And I'm just trying to break it down for somebody that
Absolutely.
may not be as versed.
There actually is an answer for this. You may or may not have ever heard the term tough but fair. But there
Mm-hmm.
are people that use Prisoner's Dilemma in order to analyze various types of strategies and have
Mm-hmm.
them effectively compete against each other uh, in a free for all of Prisoner's Dilemmas where there's different rules and different competitions. The tough but fair strategy is to have every initial reaction be positive, where you act in a way that is pro-social, essentially. And then every subsequent interaction, you reflect. So if you were
Mm.
betrayed the first time, you betray the second time. If the other person, had solidarity the first time, you have solidarity the second time. And the third time, whatever they did the second time, that's what you do. So if you were nice and they betrayed you, and then you betray and they're nice to you, then the third time you'll be nice because they were nice the last time. Just
I
whatever the
see.
last treatment you got from whatever counterparty you have is how you reflect to that counterparty the next time. And Tough But Fair has had an extraordinary run of success. It does turn out that there are some very sophisticated group strategies that can be tough but fair, but they are fragile. They're highly rules dependent. And when you change the nature of the rules of the game, frequently what you find is that particular group strategy falls apart and tough but fair once again wins the day. And these competitions have been going on for decades. University professors and other theorists try to come up with strategies, and Tough But Fair just keeps winning over and over and over and over again. And even when it is beaten, it does very well. It's second, third place, and then when the conditions change a little bit, it's back to number one. So I think you're sort of cottoning on to, again, one of these deep things that falls out of the mathematics in those sorts of scenarios. Tough but fair has been one of my sort of guiding principles for behavior for decades now.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't think maybe a lot of people may not know what it's called, but I think a lot of people are probably just doing it even at a subconscious level, right? Like especially with your kids, right? Kid misbehaves or they do something to you that's maybe a little mean, you do it mean, you do something that's mean to them, and then turn around they do something nice and then you do something in return, right? I mean, I've been doing that with my kids since day one, but never really was able to pinpoint what it's called. But okay, so you come up with this, so you figure out that applying this model in the marketplace is more efficient. Um, what happens next?
Well, uh, I start the process of trying to bring this to the world. I explore a few different options. I look at academia, I look at patents, I look at entrepreneurship, um, and I just start pushing out into these various sectors. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Academics, I was rebuffed relatively quickly.
Not
Um,
surprised.
yes, well, it turns out that that professional economics. So there is a sort of sub marketplace design called auction theory that's well developed and very impressive. Uh, that's not quite up to the level of full marketplace design, and the reason it doesn't get quite up to that level is because economics currently assumes as an axiom that our current market structure is perfect, and they actually have a proof to that effect that hangs on the assumption that that in that model I was talking about, where there's some people they're called price takers and price makers. The price takers are essentially paying the price makers to make prices for them, and the theory says that there's a proportional relationship between the rates of returns that price makers can get and the costs that are imposed on price takers. And so any effort to restrict costs for price takers would reduce rates of return for price makers, and that would cause the price makers to leave the marketplace and take their information with them. And that makes the marketplace not have good information anymore. The marketplace stops working. And so your attempt at cost savings goes bye-bye. And in all currently existing market proposals, aside from mine, there actually is a proportionality between the costs and the returns, because in all cases there's a indirect calculation of price information. But since I found a direct way to do price information, I can structure the returns in a better way that actually gives greater returns to price makers while lowering costs to price takers. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. But you know, I couldn't get anybody to sit still long enough for that. They did give me a reading list, so I read a few of the highly accepted graduate textbooks on marketplace micro design, um, and sort of picked up the lingo and learned the technicalities of that so I could improve my communication. And so a lot of what I've been doing for the last decade has been cycling my communication abilities, reaching out to people to have conversations, and figuring out how to explain this to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that I don't think that's an easy feat because it's a very complicated concept, even for somebody that's not necessarily not dumb per se, but it's just very very complicated, and maybe also because, like you said, not a lot of people are familiarized with the lingo. So if I let me look at this from like an entrepreneurship perspective. So what is the problem that this is going to solve? You mentioned earlier that when you reference the issue with the logs and identifying relevant information, is that sort of is that what happens in the marketplace as well? And are you trying to solve that problem? And
Absolutely.
if that is what happens, why does that happen? What is that issue of like overabundance of information happen?
Sure. So the fundamental issue that we're having is that our markets are becoming more and more expensive.
Okay.
Actually, Nate Silver has just written an op-ed where he references this explicitly, and he sees it as a good thing. The financial system in general sees it as a good thing. That's insane, frankly. Um,
Okay.
uh, if there's a service you depend on, let's say you receive water from the city that you live in, and your water bill is becoming a larger and larger percentage of your household budget, is that a good thing? And if it becomes a larger and larger percentage of the city's overall budget, and they're touting, hey, you know, water used to be 10% of the expense of running the city, and now water is 20% of the expense of running the city. Look at how fantastic we are at running a city. People would think they were insane.
Yeah.
But those are pretty much exactly what service providers say. They say that, this service is becoming more and more expensive. Isn't that great? And of course, that's not great. It's terrible. Uh,
Hmm.
and what's driving all of this is a disconnect at the fundamental level of how the marketplace works. The
Okay.
market is fundamentally about finding out what's inside human brains and communicating it out to the broader community. Um, but you can't just ask people because they'll be incentivized to lie. And so the market that we actually use, the large scale financial markets, have these mechanisms. They've got the market ticker, they've got the reporting, they've got the queue, they have physical infrastructure that provides that information in ways that make it so that intentional lying gets punished. But it actually gets punished by other market participants. And the way that it gets punished is that the market as a whole used to be able to move faster than those individual participants. Um, so think of it as sort of a game of tag, where if anybody started showing off, you know, sort of a game of tag where everybody's it. If anybody starts messing around or fooling off, somebody's going to be able to tag them because nobody's sort of so fast and agile they can stay away from everybody forever. Even if one person's Usain Bolt and you know, everybody else is, like a high school track star, um, if you get like 50 people there, they can sort of surround him and corral him and he can't get away with it either. Um,
Right.
but that stopped happening. The those mechanisms were computerized, and we, even if they weren't, we have the internet. So we now have this very, very large fund of orders coming in, processing that has to take place, and so on. And so what has happened is that the market now actually has this max speed that everyone's capable of operating at. You take Usain Bolt and you put him in bumper cars, and now he doesn't have a speed advantage anymore. But
Right.
we let people buy the bumper car. So some people have bumper cars that essentially, have padding and like explosive reactions and stuff, and so they just don't, never feel anything. And regular people kind of go in and get knocked around a bunch and kind of get pinballed through the system. And if you're wealthy enough and positioned enough to buy one of these bumper cars, the market isn't really working on you. You should be getting buffeted around just like everybody else when you make mistakes. But because the mechanism that the market had to make that happen stops working once you can match its capacity, and we have computers. If you buy as many computers as they do and configure them correctly, then you have that same capacity. The installation exists. And so what we now see is vastly more orders for every trade going in. So 40 years ago, the ratio between so-called paper trades and physical trades in the marketplace was around 7 to 1. Today, it's around 49 to 1. So, 7 times as much information. But even more critically than that, an enormous fraction of the orders that go into the system are never even executed. If an order executes most of the time, like over 90% of the time, the 2 ordering queues will almost completely empty out within a second or less, and completely new orders will flow in. And so right now, the market is processing in excess of a petabyte a year of data that it's throwing around. Now, petabyte, that's 1,000 terabytes. The kind of rough way to think about a petabyte is that it's approximately the amount of audio-visual information that a human body takes in over the course of a century. So if you were able to take the marketplace's information and translate it as efficiently as possible into information that you could absorb through your eyes and ears, then every year they would develop 100 years worth of reading listening material for you to absorb. So we're outside of human governance at that point.
Okay. So I do have a couple of questions, and so I want to make sure that I say what I think you said back to you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in any of it. So what you're saying is that the price of commodities is increasing because of the amount of, or I guess the lack of control that we have in processing the amount of information that is taking place in the marketplace. Is that correct?
That's again technical curly cues, but that's fair.
Okay. And why is that? How are those things correlated? So it becomes more expensive because it becomes more expensive to manage and analyze all of that data?
Well, let's think through sort of the problems that exist for the 3 sort of categories of market participants I'm talking about. So we
Okay.
have producers. So these are
Yes.
miners or loggers or fishers or farmers. They're making
Yeah.
some product they need to sell.
Sure.
They're in a high competitive space and they have fairly low margins.
Okay.
They have, in some cases, some kind of a capital reserve, but they do not have infinitely deep pockets. So
Mm-hmm.
they they are very afraid of market risk. They are somewhat afraid of sort of actual risk. Maybe by the time you harvest your wheat crop, the AMA will decide that wheat causes stroke and nobody will ever eat wheat again, and then you're
Right.
completely
Right.
screwed. But that's not much of a worry. Maybe some massive weather event will wipe out all the production in 6 states. But again, that's not their major concern. But they are
Sure.
concerned about the day, the minute, the second they show up at the marketplace, they might get caught in some kind of, cross-grain problem and get a lot less than they're expecting or need. The consumers, these are factory owners, processors and so on. They need an income stream of material to process to operate their businesses.
Yeah.
They're also operating relatively low margin businesses, although they might not have as much competition as the commodity producers do because they're probably closer to the retail side of things. They're making specific products and so on. But they are still competing with other people that are looking for this. Lots of people need steel to operate their businesses and things like that. So, again, they have some concerns about real risks of, like maybe their product will cause cancer in rats and can't be sold anymore. But they have serious concerns about market risks. They generally have slightly deeper pockets on average because they're larger concerns, but not all of them do. And so that's where they are. And then we have our third player in the game. They're the professional market traders. They love risk. They've got very deep pockets. They should have good information about what sorts of market risks and systemic risks exist. But what they're looking for is people that will take bad deals right now. They want to buy low and sell high. And the more chaotic and overwhelming the marketplace is, the less good the deals that the other two parties will accept will be. Also, the less likely the other two parties are to ever directly interact with each other. So if you're in a marketplace where 49 out of 50, 98% of the trading interest is middlemen, then you have a 0.04% chance that when you're making a deal, you're making a deal with a direct consumer or a direct producer. And it's actually technically even worse than that because of the way front running works and so on with companies like Robinhood essentially guaranteeing front running. There you have a 0% chance of getting sort of another retail counterparty through a platform like that.
What is front running?
So front running, if you've ever seen the film The Sting, it's a well understood con that got its name from horse racing.
Okay.
The idea is that when you're betting on an outcome, the best way to bet on that outcome is to exploit a communication delay. So let's say we're going to bet on the Super Bowl.
Okay.
So we don't know what the Super Bowl is, but what if I convince you to wait? We're not going to watch the Super Bowl live. We're going to tape delay the Super Bowl, and we're actually going to watch the Super Bowl a month after the Super Bowl next year.
Okay.
And 3 weeks before we watch the Super Bowl, we're going to bet on the outcome. And I'm going to pinky swear with you that neither of us are going to watch the Super Bowl before we watch our tape delay of the Super Bowl. Well, what if I watch the Super Bowl and just bet on what actually happens? I'm probably going to win. So this all becomes much more difficult to, envision when you're talking about microseconds of time delay and, light speed links and stuff like that. But all that's real. There was a film called The Hummingbird Project about these guys that drilled a hole through the Appalachian mountain chain to make a straighter line between Chicago and New York that they could run fiber optic cable through. And they were renting out that bandwidth for like hundreds of millions of dollars a minute or something for months until another group built a series of microwave relay towers, which are faster because electromagnetics move faster through air than through glass, and put them out of business. But they still made enormous amounts of money during their operational heyday, in spite of the insane costs that they incurred to drill a straight line, 1,000+ miles through America.
Okay. All right. So then, so the people that are the marketplace, obviously it derives more profit from instability, as you mentioned. So it is in their best interest to buy something at a low price and sell it at a high price. And what you're saying is that sort of practice and that instability in the marketplace, it's what also is the reason why it's driving cost upward, because it fluctuates so much, but also because people are profiting from that sort of chaos.
Effectively, yeah. What happens is the spread diverges, and so the price that you're getting at the farm gate is lower, and so the farmers are pushed to the edge, and then the price that you're paying at the the factory warehouse is higher. And as that spread widens and widens and widens, that's 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 what funds the financial sector. So the only way for the financial sector to grow as a proportion of the economy would be for the retail buyers to be paying more and the retail sellers to be receiving less. Because
I see.
if the scope was staying narrow, then the system could only grow as the economy grows.
I see. I see. And so what ends up happening is that the end consumer, I mean, just regular people like you and I, we have to be basically incurring the cost of the marketplace to be making more money. In other words,
We actually incur it as a multiplier because as each of these raw materials, like I don't consume wheat. I consume products that are made from wheat. Even flour has some processing, and so uh, if the steel market becomes deranged, and it has been, nickel, for example, which is a critical component of stainless steel, got so deranged several months ago that the marketplace had to be shut down before the stainless steel manufacturers went bankrupt. Well, stainless steel is very important because it's used in a wide variety of manufacturing contexts because it's stainless, because it non-contaminatory and so on. So driving up the cost of stainless steel then drives up the costs of replacing equipment or buying new equipment for bottling plants and bakeries and other things like that. And
hmm.
they're not eating that. They need to make their businesses profitable to stay in business. And so that drives those costs up as well. And the same thing happens for, energy, gasoline, electricity are traded, or petroleum and electricity are traded through marketplaces. As those spreads, that is something that will show up at multiple points in every supply chain. And those things add up across the cycle as production becomes more and more sophisticated. Think about how many different kinds of components there are in cars. I saw a report recently. There's a guy who, as a project, I guess, trying to become internet famous, and I guess it kind of succeeded. I think he tried to make like a his own BLT, or so it was like it was some kind of a sandwich. I think it was a BLT, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. So he grows all of his own food. He actually mines ore to like make knives and cooking utensils and like extracts. He like does everything, and according to him, accounting for what he did, it wound up costing $1,500. So if you spend less than $1,500 for meals, the reason you can get away with that is because you're getting help. You're getting help from, in many cases, functionally millions of human beings around the world for every bite of food you put in your mouth, every sip of water you take, every time you pull your shirt over your head. That's an enormous amount of help that you're getting impounded into that. And so as the system that negotiates and manages that help becomes more expensive and less efficient, all those costs go up. And you see that at the grocery store and at every other store you go to.
Got it. So it's not just inflation that drives up the cost of everything else. Like, I mean, I guess inflation is just sort of like an added problem into an already existing uh, issue with cost, right?
Sort of, yes. It's so inflation gets sort of reverse talked about in finance, because to talk about it in its real terms would make it very starkly clear exactly who's at fault. And since those people are very powerful, they don't like talking about it in those terms.
Which is who? You mean the
The
Federal Reserve System, or?
the Federal Reserve System and their enablers in the Treasury and the banks, yes.
Okay,
So the entirety of the credit extension system, which bridges our government and our private financial interests. So
got it.
that gets into why so much inflation is going on. That chaotic system I talked about requires credit expansion to drive it, and credit expansion is inflationary. And so the mechanism that they're primarily using to drive this noise is inflation. Um, so it's there's a strong interrelation and correlation between those two problems.
Okay, okay. I think I'm starting to make sense of this now. One question that is sort of like still in the back of my mind. So when we're talking about, I mean, when you say marketplace, you're talking about the stock exchange, right?
Yes, stocks and commodities
Okay,
exchanges, things like that.
okay. So let's see if you can help me break that down a little bit. So what you're saying is that they are manipulating the price of commodities to make more money. But if that's the case, how are they doing it? Like, could you maybe describe that a little more?
So it is technically unfair to say that they're manipulating the price of commodities. What they are doing is they're
Okay,
providing a forum for people to trade, and they
okay,
have mechanisms within that forum that create an environment that is supposed to create a fair trading environment.
okay,
Those mechanisms, that what I'm describing is those mechanisms being overwhelmed by the information flooding in. And so,
okay.
while they are ostensibly providing a fair environment, what they have actually done over the last quarter to third-ish century, maybe a little bit more at this point, is they're now providing an unfair environment. And in that unfair environment, uh, people are, again, not manipulating, but BSing the price, if you will. So
Okay.
it's not so much an issue, and this is what gets complicated. It's sort of very easy to think in sort of Lex Luthor terms with some sort of secret super genius with a ton of money that's making what they want to have happen, and that's
Sure.
screwing over you, Rafael Flores, specifically, because like Lex Luthor knows about you, and you're the
Right.
target.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to think about things like in those terms, but what's going on is you've got people who are incentivized to make money by making deals with people who have decided to make a deal that's not very good. And so what do?
Okay.
They offer up a bunch of not very good deals to see if anybody wants any of them. And in order to offer up a large number of not so good deals, they have to take loans effectively. So they're expanding the credit system to pretend like there's a lot of interest in these not very good deals. And
Oh, I see.
other people are also offering these other not very good deals, and the intersections of these not very good deals creates the illusion that there's a lot of not very good deals being taken that are actually functionally being passed back and forth between people that are mostly just trolling for desperate souls that will bite on these particular hooks. And that entire
Got it.
system effectively exists to wait until the fish, accidentally bites or intentionally bites or has to bite because there's no other food in the ecosystem on one of these baited hooks on a bad deal and takes it. And they're just sort of gradually wiping out all of the opportunities for the fish to do anything other than eat these baited hooks and make the bait as sort of useless as possible so it doesn't cost very much to do it.
This reminds me. So there's this book that I read once. It's called Influence by, I think it's Robert Cialdini is the right way to pronounce his name. And he talked about horse racing. So what some people would do is that they would start to bet on a horse that they knew was going to lose intentionally to drive other people to bet on that one and to give themselves an advantage. So they would get there very early and they would start betting money. And then whenever somebody else would come in and say, "Well, what horse is looking good?" The bookkeeper or whatever the person is called would say, "Oh, well, this horse is getting a lot of bets." So just because of the way that social proof works and how we're prone to basically be influenced by what we think other people are choosing, we would choose the horse that doesn't have a good opportunity to win. And so when they choose the horse that they actually think is going to win, they make a bigger profit because now they sort of drove people to bet on a horse that they knew prior to that they didn't really have a good opportunity to win, because obviously they have. It doesn't always mean that they're cheating per se, but they just have, like, more experience or additional information that the
Right.
regular
And
bettor doesn't have.
and they have enough money that they can make sort of following bets enough to change the odds when there's not much going on, in
Right.
ways that they can now make large bets at the shortened odds that they've produced that will pay for what they did before. And so some of those things urge more towards manipulation, and they're absolutely, I don't want you to, there's no conspiracies. Yes, there are, there's, the Enron scandal. There's other major issues that have come out since then. I usually don't like to talk too much about absolutely current events because they're much more contentious. But it's clear that there exist, market manipulation attempts and successes. But the much greater problem, in my view, is that the market itself has lost its capacity to bump people into line. And what that's created is an entire panoply of everything from intentional to unintentional attempts to noise up the marketplace. And the noisier the marketplace is, the more people will pay to avoid the risks of the marketplace. And we get the world that we've been in since the 70s, where the financial markets have been growing and growing and growing as a fraction of the economy.
Okay. And then when you mention, like these people that have enormous amounts of money, or these corporations that have enormous amounts of money, the reason why they're able to capitalize on such a system is because, like you mentioned, they have the resources to be able to interpret all of that noise.
Well,
Correct?
yeah, and also sort of gambler's ruin. It's like the casino. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
if you go into Vegas and you find a roulette wheel with a European wheel, so there's only one green zero on it, and it's, let's say it's a no limit wheel, which there aren't any of those that I'm aware of, but let's say they've got a no limit European wheel. So you bet red, say, and you put all your money on it. Well, it's pretty close to 50-50. I mean, the house has an edge of about 3%, I think, 3.6 or something for roulette. But but that's it. Like, you could win. It's almost a coin flip. And almost coin flips, 10 almost coin flips in a row is about one chance in 1,000. So you'd have a little bit worse, significantly worse really, of one chance in 1,000 of multiplying your money by 1,000. Now, if you put down $1 and let it ride, casino's fine. They got hundreds of millions, maybe billions. Many of these chains are owned by multinational conglomerates. They can absorb the loss. But if you put $1 billion down on that and ran the same cycle, there might be a 30 or 40% chance that the casino would actually be bankrupt if you got that win or got a couple wins in a row. There's a more than a 10% chance that you'll get 3 wins in a row, and they might not. Maybe they got a $7 billion reserve, and now the conglomerate they're attached to is bankrupt because you won 3 in a row. And if you win 10 in a row, which again, it's worse than one chance in 1,000, but they owe you $1 trillion, and nobody's got $1 trillion cash pile, so that ain't happening. And so those deep pockets mean that you can play the odds when they're shaded in your favor. And so that's what they're doing. They're on one hand, using these sort of the like horse race tactics you were talking about to shade the odds more in their favor. But on the other hand, they're playing a lot of these odds shaded in their favor games that they can afford to lose. Where, you know, the family farmers say, if they decided to take a wild risk on maybe winning, maybe losing, well, when they won, that'd be great for them. They'd do better that year. But if they ever lose, the farm's gone.
Right.
And so they never play that game because they can never afford to lose that game. Uh, but if you can afford to lose 1 or 10 or 100 or tens of thousands, then you can play a lot of those games. You know, if you can afford to lose 10,000 games, you can play 5,000, you know, day in, day out. And with the odds shaded in your favor, you'll win enough that when you come back tomorrow, you're going to be able to win more than 10,000 games. And the day after that, you're going to be able to do it again. And you just keep happening.
Okay. Okay. Um, so let's jump back into your thesis. So what you're saying is that by implementing the system that you've come up with, which leverages game theory, you would be able to break that down for us.
Well, we've been sort of nibbling around the edges. The key thing to understand is that what the middlemen are bringing to the table and what the entire goal of going to the marketplace in the first place for the retail players is information. Knowing what that price is going to be negotiated out at between the two sides is why you're there in the first place.
Okay.
So we have developed the mathematics and science of information over the last 80-ish years at this point, to a very high degree, and we happen to know that information is a physical, measurable thing that we can build devices to process in completely repeatable and understandable ways. And
Okay.
so rather than having a system where people are offering ephemeral trades which are going to go away within a millionth of a second, I say let's have a negotiation system where people are declaring where they think prices are heading. And we can use integration techniques to create a consensus of all the points of view. And then we can use a clearinghouse structure to test that consensus by saying, okay, this is the deal that's been negotiated. How much do people want to buy? How much do people want to sell? So it works at that point the way your gas station works. You know, your gas station changes their prices sometimes every day. And then they tell everybody what the price is, and however many people want to buy gas at those prices show up and buy the gas. If they get the prices wrong, which would be all the way back up at the market, because those, again, there's a connection between the market petroleum price and what the station person puts up on the gas thing. Again, some technical currently cues there, but if they get it wrong, then people will stop driving as much because price is too high, or they'll have shortages, which has happened in the 70s, when they decided to control the price of gas and they got it wrong, and suddenly there wasn't any gas to buy anymore. That system then takes the commissions from the trades that occur at the deal that's been negotiated and pays off the negotiators based on a pro rata system where the more of your information that was useful to the negotiation, the greater the share of that commission that you're getting. And by adjusting the costs of negotiating and the rewards of negotiating, we can actually make the rate of return, the ROI, arbitrarily high for negotiators. And by deciding what the commission of the negotiated deal structure will look like, we can make the costs for the actual delivery and delivery and deliverable sides of the thing arbitrarily low. So we can make the market cheaper than markets are today and offer higher rates of return for information than markets offer, and that's a better marketplace.
Okay, yeah, because I mean, if I understand you correctly, you're incentivizing the offer to say, well, to provide more information to make a better decision, and the more information they provide, then they get a higher commission on how much of that information would use to set the price of a commodity. Correct?
Yep.
Okay, so I think that makes sense. And obviously, again, you're incentivizing people to be more open and more transparent. I feel. But then we get into sort of like the problem that you're encountering now, where you're trying to introduce this and you're trying to get this patented. And I'll actually, before I went to why do you need to get this patented again? Maybe we could share that with us as well.
Well, patenting isn't necessarily required, but what this is intellectual property. There are
Okay.
several different kinds of intellectual property, uh, but without a patent, it wouldn't really be possible to monetize this in particular ways. Um, Legally speaking, you without the patent, you don't have the right of restriction that would attach to other kinds of intellectual property like copyright, which I enjoy, for example. So this system is written up in a white paper. There's some code that implements this. Those things that I have a friend that actually wrote some open source code with my help and direction. So that code is copyrighted to him and it's open source. I have some code that I've never published. I've got it actually on that shelf right there. But that's copyrighted to me. The white paper is public. It's also copyrighted to me. But copyright is too specific, essentially, to form the basis of an intellectual property licensure transfer of this kind and type. Whereas the patent would be general enough that I would be able to use that as leverage of value to try to get this system into the world. There are currently 4 projects around the planet that are attempting to build markets that incorporate my technology, but setting up marketplaces is expensive in its own right, and and finding a way to bridge that expense gap is something that the patent would probably be helpful for. There is precedent for companies like the CME Group, the New York Stock Exchange, the LME, buying or licensing patented technologies to incorporate into their systems, where there is not a similar precedent for open source, incorporation and so on.
Okay. And then so you go to the patent office. Patent office is sort of making you go through all these hoops. So walk us through that whole journey because I think it's very interesting.
Okay, well, so I got my patent application in June 2016. 6 months later, they assign it to a patent examiner. That's a pretty ordinary time scale if you haven't paid. Basically, I'm operating on a shoestring, so everything that you could pay to accelerate, I haven't. So this is what it looks like when you can't afford to do that. The clerk then has a turnaround time. The different kinds of patents have different average turnaround times. In my case, it was, I think, about 2.5 years for the
Sheesh.
turnaround. That's not uncommon. The worst case at that time that I'd heard about was a 3-year delay. I'm not currently up on where the delays are, but I've heard they've gotten worse. So I don't know if more people are out at the 3-year delay mark, or if there are now 4 and 5 year delays that are in some departments, but I've heard from a number of sources that it's getting slower and harder. So at any rate, it's fairly ordinary for the clerk to, or the examiner to reject your initial application. They'll bring up some prior art potentially. That's one of the easy ways for something not to be patentable. If you're patenting something that somebody else has already published, it doesn't have to be patented. But if people already know, if you were to attempt to patent, television, televisions already exist. If you were to attempt to patent fire, fire is already well known to humanity. You can't get that patent. So they'll try that. They also, check your grammar and stuff like that. They're looking for flaws. So there was a slight disconnect between the strategy that my attorneys were pursuing and what I was willing to allow to be pursued. So the initial objection signaled that some formulas that were in the patent looked good, and that they were probably patentable, and the attorney said, that's great, we'll just take these and stick them in the clause that we were intended to stick them in the first place. You'll get your patent, everything's good to go. And I had pointed out to them during the process of drafting the patent, and I re-pointed out that the formulas were exemplars, not the core of the system. And so we had to go broader slightly than that. I hope slightly. At any rate, this led to, not so much a two-step, but sort of a toe-tapping, extra steps type of thing. They brought out several cases of intended prior art. Probably the most serious one is something called the Lang patent, which actually has been bought by the CME Group. And speaking of horse racing, these guys patented every kind of parimutuel system they could imagine. And that's how horse racing works, is parimutuel betting. My patent contained the word parimutuel. It's a slight misrepresentation of that word, but it's the closest to the concept I was getting at that is in common use in the English language. And so since there was already a patent on every kind of parimutuel game, that these mathematicians could imagine, that looked like a pretty solid way to knock me out of the park. It turned out that because of some mathematics having to do with the nature of multiple infinities, that their patent actually did something called teaching away, where they specifically excluded the kinds of things that I'm talking about from the kinds of things that they're talking about. And so the Lang patent, they couldn't use it at all. It was totally useless. And I was able to find that and explain to my attorneys so that they could explain to my examiner why that was the case. But as I said, we had a few more back and forths. They came up with some more prior art tries, but ultimately in September of 2019, so this would be roughly 3 years and 3 months after my initial filing, I got a notice of acceptance. Then my attorneys called me and said that the examiner's supervisor had called them, my attorneys, and told them that in all likelihood, the notice of acceptance that I had would not be honored. So there is a procedure for withdrawal of notice of acceptance. There's a space inside the patent office called quality control. And they oversee things, and they can overrule. And when they do, those acceptances are withdrawn, and there's a procedure for doing that. That procedure is not having your point of contact's boss call you and say, we're probably just not going to do our jobs. Like, that's not the procedure. So my attorney said we've had acceptances withdrawn in the past. We have never had an examiner supervisor contact us and say we're probably not going to do our jobs before. Um, but they had a theory. There was a case that there was a patent case called American Axle versus Nico, and people want to look it up. It's a crazy story. I'm not going to tell it, but it had gotten up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had agreed to hear it. And my attorney's theory was that the world was about to change, and that the patent office might be leery in general of doing things until the world had changed. So we should sort of hold our powder and see what happened. As it happened, the Supreme Court kept that case sort of on their docket for 2 years, and then after it became over those 2 years, it was becoming more and more controversial. They decided that it wasn't important enough to actually hear, and so they never actually scheduled or heard that case. Anyway, I only had a limited time window, so come December, if I had not applied for a patent after receiving an acceptance, then it would just go into the public domain, and I would never be able to get the patent. I had no rejection. They hadn't said anything to us, and so we filed for that patent at that time. We didn't get the ordinary response to that, and so when we got back to them after Christmas and New Year's and said, "Hey, what's up? We're doing what we're supposed to do. What are you guys going to do now?" They said, "We're definitely not giving you the patent, and we haven't figured out why yet. We're going to get back to you in a little while." Okay. At least the thing's still alive, but who knows what's going on. Ultimately, they came back with the claim. Multiple claims. They claimed effectively that it was completely unpatentable, and they had a couple more sort of desperation plays at prior art. Those desperation plays were really desperate and were easy to knock down. They had some grammar things that my lawyer said that they could clean up no problem. But their sort of big gun was that this wasn't patentable because it did not represent an improvement on the state of the art. It wasn't actually better.
Does it have to be better to be patentable though?
Yes.
Yes, okay. But how would they know that?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Algorithmic analysis is actually something that we have a lot of math and physics around. And my system represents a roughly 300,000-fold advance on the existing system. And I know this for certain because, as I said, I've got a copy of the core mechanics on my shelf over there. And when I wrote it a decade ago, the 3-generation older laptop that I had at the time was capable of carrying out the processing required to operate half of the global economy using that system. The modern laptops, like we are currently using more than enough bandwidth and CPU that my system would be able to operate the entire global economy on this connection if we had to, because that's what the nature of a 300,000-fold improvement looks like. And there's a lot of very solid math and physics and engineering papers that have been produced over the decades explaining exactly what this means. I've read a fair number of them. I'm certain I haven't read them all. They're making them more all the time. It's one of the things that's very fascinating about computational mathematics. But one of the most famous ones is from the 80s, where a guy took a Cray, that was the supercomputer brand of the 80s, and using Fortran, which to this day is one of the most efficient high data processing languages that exists, and also had a home computer running BASIC, which neither of those are very impressive, and had each one of them perform the task of sorting 1 million items. However, The algorithm that was used on the Fortran Cray system was something called bubble sort, and the algorithm used on the home computer basic system was something called quicksort. And at 1,000,000 items, quicksort is roughly 50,000 times more efficient than quicksort is. Or than bubble sort is. Quicksort's 50,000 times more efficient than bubble sort is. And in general, supercomputers are about 10 years ahead of the curve, if you will. So that in a sort of Moore's law sense of the world, that's giving you about 100-fold improvement. So if my algorithm is 50,000 times better than your algorithm and your hardware is 100 times better than my hardware, then I will outperform you by a factor of 500.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that's the fundamental source of where the cost savings and environmental savings and all the rest of it comes from algorithmic improvements. That's the core justification going back to the 80s for process and software patents in the first place. And so bringing that, it's not bringing a knife to a gunfight. It's crawling inside the barrel of like a battleship during a gunfight and just figuring that you're going to be fine. Like, I just blew them completely out of the water. It took a little while for me to assemble this argument in a way that my attorneys could sort of digest, and then they wrote a very sharp letter that more or less said, if you want to defend this in court, we'd be happy to end your career.
Mhm.
And so in February of 2021, we got a second notice of acceptance.
Interesting.
We applied immediately for the patent, and 3 weeks later, that notice of acceptance was withdrawn.
Jesus Christ. Why?
Well, my attorneys had a conference with my examiner and his supervisor, and they're not allowed to talk about whoever it is that's giving them the orders, which, again, the QC department are people whom they are not allowed to talk about. So it definitely might be them. But they said, this is happening. It's out of our hands. It's coming from places we're not allowed to talk about. We don't agree with this assessment. Like, you've jumped through all of our hoops. We don't have any objections we can really put forth. But our hands are tied. So we'll write up what our objections are in about a month. And so they write up what their objections are, and their new objection is that this isn't patentable because it would involve me controlling the entire economy, that this is a fundamental economic activity patent, and it's so broad that I would control all economic activity. And that's where we get to some of those technical curlicues of things you were thinking about before. This is about specific mechanisms that enable you to operate a marketplace using those mechanisms. And I've been very careful to try to not implicate both the underlying mathematics, which has a lot of other potential applications, which I do not wish this patent to include, and it doesn't implicate sort of broad economic activity, because I also don't want that to happen.
Right.
So they claim that I didn't not do that, and that it sort of implicates all of the economy. And they also said, it's out of our hands. So, like, if you logically knock this down, which you clearly can, because it's obviously nonsense, paraphrasing from them, I've only got hearsay through my attorneys. We're not going to change our decision because it's not our decision to change. You're at the end of the road here. So the only road that's left at that point is you appeal. So colloquially, there's a term called patent court. The actual term is, the patent and trademark appellate board is PTAB or something, but it's the patent board basically.
Yeah.
So I worked with my attorneys. We filed that appeal. In between the filing of that appeal, I did open up a case with my congressional office to see if I could find out what was going on, sort of FOIA type ideas. The congressional office, there was a staffer there who'd been a chief of staff for multiple congressmen. He's worked in Washington for, almost as long as I've been alive. And he said that basically they can get full reports out of the bureaucracy and get some kind of an idea what's going on. It'll take, 4 to 6 weeks. They usually won't change their minds, but at least you'll know what's going on. It won't just be a form letter. It took longer than 4 to 6 weeks. It took more like 8 or 9 weeks. It was a form letter. The form letter relayed the timeline that I just gave you. However, they left out the first notice of acceptance in 2019, so it was actually false. And they had a little sort of end note for the congressional office saying that under Patent Office policy, the Patent Office only communicates through a single channel on any issue, and that since I had a lawyer, that was it, and so that they were never going to respond to the congressional office again. That was very much news to my congressional office. They were actually handling other people with patent issues at that time. As I said, COVID seems to have really taken a toll on the patent office, and so there's a lot of discontent among inventors about the patent office for a wide variety of reasons. So I was not alone in having an issue with the patent office. At my congressional office alone, I was alone in, having the congressional office being reprimanded for talking to the patent office. And I'm also alone in having a procedural breakdown where an acceptance was ignored and then lied about to Congress. These are unique things for me. At any rate, I tell my attorneys about this. We file an appeal. In July of 2023, we received a missive from the Patent Office saying that the appeal was scheduled to be heard in July of 2025. In July of 2024, they actually decided to hear the appeal anyway. So that just happened. And they decided to deny the patent because the original reason from 2020 wasn't addressed in our appeal, and so they decided to resurrect it and say that because we didn't reiterate that it was mathematically and scientifically and economically and engineeringly bankrupt, that they could just reassert that it was true, and so they did. They also used the language where I pointed out that my system was in fact better because it could in fact outcompete the existing markets, to reaffirm that meant that I was claiming that I could control all economic activity. They quoted Supreme Court precedent from the 70s when the court was adamantly eliminating process and software and algorithmic patents to create the precedent for this being one of those class of patents and consequently uncreatable. And then they cited Supreme Court rulings from the 2010-2014 range, after which the Supreme Court had overturned the substance of those 70s rulings, because now obviously these things are patentable, to talk about the sort of current requirements, and those requirements actually refer to physically measurable qualities like these algorithmic improvements, and they just declared that, in their opinion, I didn't meet those qualities without any assertion as to the foundations or reasoning chains that led to those things. So it's a smorgasbord of arguments which are both mutually contradictory and internally self-contradictory. But it does contain the statement that they affirm that I can't have the patent. My attorneys say that really the only option they could see would be filing appeals to actual courts and sort of driving up the chain, presumably the Supreme Court. They said that they feel that my case in particular, being so exceptional, would be one that, if it were to make it to the Supreme Court, could actually do some good and might have a chance of something like that. But, highly speculative, obviously. They also noted that, in general, from their experience and the experience of their peers, the patent system is become quite the quagmire in the wake of really the American Axle NEPCO thing, and that patent granting or not granting at this point seems to be effectively a lottery ticket, that if you are fortunate in whatever personalities you happen to be interacting with, then you'll wind up with a patent. And if you're unfortunate in whatever personalities you're dealing with, then you will not wind up with a patent, and the merits of the patent are largely irrelevant to that process. They have filed a separation of themselves from the case so that I can actually talk to people in the patent office about it. And I am hopefully this week, although it might take even longer for that. The patent office can take, according to them, as many as 2 weeks to process a separation claim. So we'll see. But I will be able to talk to people in the patent office and see what sorts of options might exist. I'm quite incensed, and I'm pretty much I'm taking this very personally at this point.
Yeah, I mean, how can you not? And I love any conspiracy as much as the next guy, and I usually try to look at things like this, and like sort of like analyze it for what it is. And so when I'm listening to your story, and I mean, it's kind of hard to not think that there is some sort of secret hand at play here. I mean, you are talking about disrupting. You're talking about disrupting a lot of people's power. You're talking about essentially, changing the entire economic system in many ways. And so, like, I could see, some of that in there. But on the other hand, like, sort of the things that you've mentioned, it could also just be complete incompetence in a very, very bureaucratic sort of red tape system that just doesn't really understand exactly what you're presenting to them. So, based on your experience, based on what you've talked about with your lawyers, what do you think is more likely at this point?
I really can't judge, because I have such a disconnection between my communication with these people. I don't really have any sense of where they are.
Okay.
The I've encountered a lot of incompetence, so there's enough there to explain it in that fashion. But again, from talking to my attorneys and other attorneys, and looking at sort of the shape of the cases, there's a lot of fear around disruptive patenting, at any scale. And the American Axle NEPCO, again, I don't really want to tell the whole tale, but to some extent, the patent system, the judges decided to find in favor of a larger company that absolutely violated a smaller company's patent. Now, what gets crazy is that the way they did it potentially injures the patent system as a whole. But but in a sort of a story of the patents as a sort of a slingshot for the David Goliath, outcomes, that if one lone voice can do something right, we as a society can benefit from it, and the patent system exists to help promote that. That's not the world that the patent system lives in anymore. Most of the economic benefit coming out of the patent system is actually pretty formally engaged within the sort of big pharma umbrella tent,
That makes sense.
where that's a very well oiled machine that even so is starting to break down. I was on a podcast about a month ago, I recorded, I think, where they were talking about AI and pharma's intersection, and that there's apparently, I think she said it was a $246 billion patent cliff, where the pipeline, for whatever reason, I think non-trivially because COVID has created a gap delay in processing speeds. There's almost $250 billion of patents that are expiring in the next year or two, and there is not a similarly sized pipe behind them, because of this COVID gap or innovation gap or combination or whatever, where pharma is trying to figure out what they might be able to do about that.
So what's next for you then? Let's say, worst case scenario, the patent office doesn't budge. You're not they completely deny your ability to get a patent. I would hate to think that that's where your technology is gonna lie. So
Well,
what is your sort of like Hail Mary shot after that?
yeah. So as I said, there are other avenues that I have been pursuing, and there are
Okay.
4 different projects around the planet that are trying to get off the ground that incorporate the technology. The most recent one of which also got started in July. There's NDAs involved, so I can't talk to a great extent about what it is involved there, but
Sure.
that may well generate some consulting fees, which would, keep the wolf from the door long enough for me to keep waving that flag and continuing to search for more. I've got some feelers out in the Horn of Africa because cocoa is getting a little crazy. So there's actually an economist from Ghana I'm speaking to, and there's another podcast I was on with a woman from Nigeria whose family is in the cocoa business. So, a couple things. Maybe that will come to something. Maybe it won't. So I continue to look for these opportunities around smaller and more marginal marketplaces, and people with interests in having an economy, to find opportunities for this to happen. Most of these things, again, are international, where the patent wasn't relevant in the first place. So it doesn't really change that at all. In terms of the patent office itself, I'm going somewhat scorched earth. I have actually already filed a case with the Commerce's Inspector General's office, about incompetence, certainly, and malfeasance, possibly, in the decision-making chain that's involved in my case, because these statements are tautologically false. There's no truth value that you could weight any of their opinions with, which result in the conclusions being reachable. So that's as bad as it gets, basically, for a judgment. And as I said, the case file separation is hopefully happening reasonably soon, and I intend to talk to as many of these people as I can actually get a hold of or get into a room with, and have them treated however it is possible to treat them professionally or legally, for behavior that's this incompetent or illegal.
Right. Yeah, and I guess what I would say is I think that getting yourself out there is probably a really good strategy as well, right? Like building more awareness around, well, first of all, building more awareness on the issue, which again, I don't really think a lot of people even understand. I mean, because I think everybody experiences the issues that you've described so eloquently throughout our conversation, but not a lot of people really understand the why, right? So sort of bringing it down to that level where people can understand, like, why are you why are we paying so much for basic products? What is going on in our economy, and how is that affecting the regular person, and how is that making the the people in power is economically, why, how is it making them wealthier? And so, like, again, I don't think a lot of people just understand the concept, even though they experience it on the day to day.
Yeah, well, that's one of the real problems with complexity. And one of the things that we've very foolishly done with the adoption of computers is radically cranked up the complexity level of our civilization. Um, because, some MBA with a spreadsheet can design ever more meticulous and crazy little, like, subroutines and small print in the red tape, to
Yeah,
try to pick off people here and there. And um,
yeah,
again, this isn't something that started, yesterday or 4 years ago, or at the turn of the millennium. This is something we've been doing for pretty much since computers were rolled out in the first place.
yeah.
And at this point, we've picked off enough people that we're starting to really feel their absence in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. I also think that, I mean, it's gonna it's I think the more that you do this, it's only a matter of time before a bigger sort of show, right, picks it up as well, and then all of a sudden you'll have this massive platform from where you'll be able to speak your message. So I think that just having the consistency that you've had, not just in dealing with the patent office, because let me tell you, I lived in Russia for 3 years, and dealing with the bureaucracy was probably the only thing I hated the most, or just hated in general about that experience, right? Like dealing with visas, or like even my wife, there was a one letter misspelling in the translation of a Russian and American passport, so now she can't renew her passport. And so it's like all of these very stupid, nonsensical things that I don't know exactly where you have driven. I guess you probably understand how much of a better world you would make with your technology and your approach, and that's probably, I guess, as far as I can, as far as I can tell, what's keeping you moving forward. But let me tell you, as somebody that's dealt with bureaucracy at a very limited level, it is extremely disheartening and annoying and angering.
Yeah, well, and to some extent, I mean, I've been very angry for quite a few years with them. I found the whole objection based on not an improvement to be absolutely enraging, for example. Uh,
Yeah,
there is a slight disconnect. I mean, I don't want to say anything bad about my attorneys. I think they were great. I think they've basically been doing the best job that was available all along. But my attorneys and I have different incentives and different interests in this. And
nah,
one of the differences is I actually don't really believe that the Patent Office in its current incarnation is particularly valuable. And I'm okay with a denial of this patent in ways that more generally restricts the kinds of patents which are grantable, which is something that my attorneys are not particularly okay with. Um,
hmm,
and this is a major risk, actually, in the Supreme Court rulings that they cited. They actually quoted the part where the court was talking about the risk of swallowing up the entire patent system. The objections and the kinds of things that they're coming after me with are, logically speaking, incredibly delicate. And the declarations they made in reference to my patent are such that if they were the actual policies of the US Patent Office, there wouldn't be patents. There wouldn't be any future patents. There wouldn't be any existing patents. There wouldn't be any past granted patents. None of them are good enough to pass muster, basically,
Yeah.
of what they are claiming I'm not coming up to snuff on. And so I am absolutely interested in pursuing that angle of things of, do you want to quit your job to stop me from having this patent? Because that's what you said you were going to do. And we'll see. I have every reason to believe that the bureaucracy will be stubborn and intransigent and useless, but
As it is. Yeah.
yes, but I do have another whole sort of angle that I can pursue on my own that my attorneys can't and wouldn't in the first place because of their own professional interests.
Yeah. Well, Noah, what I'll say is, I mean, anything that I can do, or our show can do to support you, obviously, you can count on that, and I believe in what you're doing. I think that uh, innovation, and I think breaking away from the old systems is exactly what we should be doing right now, as opposed to trying to salvage something that clearly is not working, right? At least not working in the interest of the general population. So, like I said, whatever we can do to support you, we will continue to do, and we will continue to help you on your journey. Now, if people, let's say, other people that might have listened to this episode and feel that they want to participate in aiding you in some way, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, you can reach out, Noah P. Healy at yahoo.com or LinkedIn. I'm Noah Healy, Noah-Healy on there. I do still have the petition up around the patent, and it's very low effort. You can just put your name down at change.org under CDM_patent. If that, share it with your friends. If that were to go viral, that would do many of the things you're talking about with sort of a large platform. Even in this day and age, bureaucrats really don't like being the object of public ridicule. So if that comes to bear, I think that might be the tool that finally loosens the grit, if you will. But yeah, those would be the biggies.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we'll put all of that in the description of the video, and again, any way that we can help and support you, I want you to know that you can count on it. So Noah, sort of like in parting here, what is like a key takeaway that you hope people will have from our conversation here?
Well, that the sort of, I guess, number one, the day-to-day worsening struggles that are surrounding us aren't in your imagination. You're not alone. You're going to need to build new coalitions and new society around yourself to get past those things, because the kind that we already have isn't working. And if you're interested in a system that works at scale a lot better than what we have, explore coordinated discovery markets. You'll be able to find plenty of online resources. And again, you can reach out to me, and please do, because that's exactly what I'm looking for, is people that want to build the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Noah, thank you again so much for your time. And I am sure that we're going to have to do it again in the next few months, just because, well, not only do you have a lot of different topics that you can cover in depth, which I think is amazing, but we also want to keep following you and your journey. And again, right, I'm excited to see where things are going to turn out for you. So again, Noah, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.